There is a man you have never heard of who almost changed the world. Not through war, not through revolution, not through the kind of dramatic upheaval that fills the pages of history books. He tried to change it through mathematics, through logic, through a proposal so elegant, so rational, and so obviously superior to what we currently use that when you hear it for the first time, your first reaction is not amazement. It is a very simple, very quiet question. Why don't we already do this? His name was Moses Cotsworth, and in 1902 he published an analysis that should have rewritten the foundation of how every human being on this planet experiences time. It did not. And the reason it did not is the real story, not the story of a failed reform. The story of who benefits when the calendar stays broken. And once you understand that, you will never look at a monthly bill, a quarterly report, or a missed deadline the same way again. But before we get to Cotsworth, before we get to the boardrooms and the committees and the silence that followed, we need to start somewhere more personal than politics. We need to start with your body, because your body already knows the truth that the calendar refuses to tell you. Think about the last time you felt truly in rhythm with the world around you, not rushed, not behind, not vaguely disoriented by the fact that some months have 28 days and some have 31. And you can never quite remember which is which without counting on your knuckles like a child. There is a reason that feeling of being in sync is so rare. And the reason is not your productivity habits or your sleep schedule or anything else the self-improvement industry would like to sell you. The reason is that the system you use to measure time was not designed for your biology. It was not designed for human beings at all. It was designed for emperors. Here is the number that changes everything: 28. The human menstrual cycle averages 28 days, not a month in any calendar we currently use. Not 30 days, not 31, 28. 13 of those cycles fit into a solar year almost exactly. 13 months of 28 days equals 364 days. Add one single transitional day, a day outside the regular count, and you have 365. A complete solar year, perfect, whole, repeating without remainder. The moon's sidereal orbit, its true cycle measured against fixed stars, is 27.3 days. The synodic cycle, the time between identical moon phases, is 29.5. 28 sits directly between these two measurements. It is not an approximation, it is an averaging. As if the number was placed there deliberately, at the precise midpoint between the body and the sky, as if someone wanted to build a bridge between the two. Someone did. And then someone else tore it down. Now look at what we were given instead. Months named after Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, who both decided their personal months needed to be 31 days, because 30 was not impressive enough for an emperor. Days were literally stolen from February and given to July and August to satisfy two men's vanity. That is not mythology. That is documented history. The calendar you wake up to every morning was partially designed around the ego of men who have been dead for 2,000 years. And we have never once been asked whether we would like a different arrangement. Moses Cotsworth asked that question. In 1902, he published a proposal for what he called the International Fixed Calendar, 13 months, 28 days each, every month identical, every quarter perfectly equal. The first of every month always falls on the same day of the week. Every year, without adjustment, without the maddening irregularity that makes financial comparison across periods nearly impossible. He named the 13th month Sol, and he placed it between June and July, at the height of summer, at the fullest point of the solar year. The name itself carried weight. Sol, the sun, positioned at the precise moment when the sun is most powerful. This was not a random bureaucratic insertion. This was a calendar built with intention, built around the rhythms of the natural world rather than the ambitions of the political one. Now you might be wondering why you have never heard of this. You might be assuming the proposal was simply ignored, the way fringe ideas are ignored, shuffled into a drawer somewhere, and forgotten by serious people doing serious work. That is what you are supposed to think. But here is where the story becomes something else entirely. George Eastman heard about the International Fixed Calendar. George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, one of the most powerful industrialists in American history, a man who built an empire from the ground up, and whose company by the 1920s was known in virtually every country on Earth. Eastman did not politely, endorse the idea. He did not write a favorable letter and move on. In 1928, he adopted the International Fixed Calendar for internal use at Kodak, completely, company-wide. Every schedule, every accounting period, every quarter, restructured around 13 months of 28 days. And then he watched what happened. Productivity improved. Administrative burden dropped. The financial records were cleaner. The comparisons were honest. The quarters were equal, genuinely equal, for the first time. Eastman described it as the most rational decision his company had ever made in terms of internal organization. He kept it. Kodak ran on the 13-month calendar from 1928 until 1989, 61 years, through the Second World War, through the entire post-war economic boom, through decades of corporate expansion and technological change, 61 years of a calendar that worked, inside one of the most successful companies in the history of American industry. And Eastman did not stop at his own boardroom. He began to campaign. He testified. He lobbied. He funded public advocacy for global calendar reform. He used every ounce of his considerable influence to push this idea into the international conversation. And the international conversation, for a brief and remarkable moment, actually listened. The League of Nations took up the question of calendar reform in the 1920s. Committees were formed. Submissions arrived from governments, from businesses, from religious institutions, from ordinary citizens around the world. Hundreds of proposals were considered. The International Fixed Calendar was among the leading candidates. There was genuine institutional momentum behind the idea, real political weight, the kind of weight that historically precedes change. And then, almost nothing. The reform stalled. The committees dissolved. The momentum did not shift to another proposal. It simply evaporated. By the mid-1930s, the conversation had effectively ended. No famous vote, no famous defeat, no climactic session where a superior argument dismantled the reformers. The Gregorian calendar remained. The International Fixed Calendar was quietly shelved. And within a generation, most people alive would not even know that the attempt had been made. This is the part that should disturb you. Not the failure itself. Reforms fail. Ideas are rejected. That is the ordinary machinery of history. What should disturb you is the texture of this failure. Because when you go looking for what happened, when you actually go into the archives and try to trace the moment when the momentum broke, you find something unexpected. You find gaps. The Cotsworth papers, housed at a major university archive, contain significant absences around the years of peak lobbying. Not damage, not ordinary archival deterioration, gaps that cluster specifically around the most consequential moments, the years when the debate was closest to resolution. Key correspondence from the League of Nations committees is incomplete, meeting minutes that summarize discussions without recording their substance, references to documents that simply do not appear in the official files. This is not the ordinary entropy of institutional memory. This is a pattern. And patterns in archives, particularly patterns of selective absence around moments of potential change, do not appear by accident. So, who benefits from the chaos? Let us be precise about this, because the answer is not abstract. Irregular months create irregular accounting periods. Irregular accounting periods require professional interpretation. They require intermediaries, consultants, analysts, entire industries whose existence depends on the complexity of navigating a system that does not divide cleanly, a quarter soul. With 91 days is not comparable to a quarter with 92 days without adjustment. Performance metrics across monthly periods require conversion factors when the months themselves are not equal. Every time a business, a bank, a government department tries to make an honest comparison across time, the irregularity of the Gregorian calendar inserts itself as friction. And friction, in financial systems, is not a neutral force. Friction benefits those who are positioned to profit from the confusion it creates. It benefits those who sell the tools and expertise needed to navigate that confusion. It benefits, in short, the intermediaries. And the intermediaries, in the 1920s as now, were not without influence. George Eastman died in 1932. His company continued to use the 13-month calendar for nearly 6 more decades without him. And then, in 1989, with no major announcement and no official explanation, Kodak quietly transitioned back to the Gregorian system. 61 years of a better calendar, abandoned in silence. No press release, no stated reason, just a decision made somewhere by someone and implemented without ceremony, as if the entire experiment had never happened. Now hold that thought for a moment, because there is something even older underneath all of this. Something that reaches far beyond Cotsworth and Eastman and the League of Nations into a pattern that repeats across continents and across millennia in a way that is very difficult to explain as coincidence. The Maya built the most precisely engineered timekeeping system ever constructed by a pre-industrial civilization. Their calendar is built around cycles of 13 and 20. The number 13 moves through their entire chronological architecture like a spine. The ancient Egyptians used a civil calendar of 12 months plus 5 additional days, days explicitly placed outside the regular monthly count, days considered sacred or dangerous. A transitional buffer between one cycle and the next, the same architecture, one day outside the regular count to complete the year. The Druids of pre-Roman Britain maintained a lunar calendar based on the 28-day cycle. The Aubrey holes at Stonehenge, 56 pits arranged in a precise circle, have been proposed for decades as a lunar tracking device. 56, 2 cycles of 28. The Lakota, the Yoruba, cultures separated by oceans and centuries, arriving at the same underlying structure. Historians call this parallel evolution. They say that independent cultures, studying the same sky, naturally arrived at similar solutions. But here is the problem with that explanation. When Rome conquered the territories of Western Europe, it did not simply offer the Julian calendar as an alternative. It suppressed the existing systems. Druids who maintained the Celtic lunar calendar were targeted. Their traditions were criminalized. Their knowledge, which was oral, which lived in human memory rather than on paper, was deliberately disrupted. When the Gregorian calendar replaced the Julian in 1582, entire cultures lost days from their legal record overnight. People went to sleep in one month and woke up in another. Buildings were dated under systems that had ceased to exist. And each of these transitions was framed not as a political act, as a conquest of one timekeeping system by another, but as a correction, as modernization, as the replacement of superstition with science. What we are never told is what was lost in each correction, what rhythms were severed, what synchronization was broken, and whether the breaking was incidental to the agenda or the agenda itself. There is emerging research in a field called chronobiology, the study of biological time, that suggests something remarkable and deeply uncomfortable for a civilization that has built itself around the Gregorian calendar. Human cognitive function, immune response, hormonal regulation, emotional stability, these are not fixed. Constants. They oscillate. They move in cycles. And the health of those cycles depends substantially on how well they align with the natural rhythms of the world outside the body. Light cycles, lunar cycles, seasonal transitions. The science is young, the implications are not yet fully mapped, but the question it opens is one that does not close easily. What does it do to a human being, across the span of an entire life, to live permanently slightly out of step with the rhythms their body was built to follow? What does it do to a society across generations? We do not know, because we have never, in the era of modern measurement, lived any other way. There are communities that maintain the 28-day count into the modern era. Ethnographers who spent time among them noted something difficult to quantify, a different relationship to urgency, to waiting, to the present moment. Not primitive, not simple, different, as if time were something you lived inside rather than something that was always slightly ahead of you, always slightly beyond your reach, always requiring a device, an authority, an intermediary to tell you where you are within it. We were handed a broken clock. We were told it was the only clock that had ever existed. And the most insidious thing about that, the thing that makes it genuinely difficult to see, is that a broken clock is still functional. It still tells you the time. It still gets you to your appointments. It still marks the passage of days and months and years. It is just irregular enough that you never quite feel at home within it. Just complex enough that you always need help understanding it. Just chaotic enough that the chaos serves someone, somewhere, very well. Moses Cotsworth saw this. George Eastman saw this. The reformers of the 1920s saw this, and they built a coalition around the vision of something better. Not perfect, not utopian, just more honest, more aligned. 13 months of 28 days. A calendar that your body could feel without counting. A system that the sky had been modeling for longer than any empire that ever tried to replace it. That coalition was not defeated by a better argument. It was not dismantled by superior logic or public opposition. The archives suggest it was met with something quieter and more effective than any argument. It was met with silence. Strategic, deliberate, selective silence. The kind of silence that leaves gaps in the record precisely where the record should be fullest. The kind of silence that, when you know to look for it, speaks more clearly than any document that survived. George Eastman's company ran on the 13-month calendar for 61 years. And when it stopped, it did so without explanation, as if someone had simply decided the experiment was over and no one needed to know why. What else was decided in a room we were never told about? What else is running on a calendar whose logic we were never given the chance to question? The investigation is not over. It is barely beginning.